Have you ever looked around and wondered why it seems like everyone else is surrounded by friends while you feel like you're standing alone? If you've ever had that thought, you're not alone. There have been times in my life when I've asked myself the same thing. Why does life feel this way? Why is my circle so small? My wife and I have walked through seasons where it felt like we were the only ones. We would sit together and wonder why it was just the two of us while the world outside seemed so connected. But what I've learned over the years is this: it's not by accident. If you feel isolated, it's not because God has forgotten you, it's because He's preparing you for something greater. Before we dive deeper, I want to encourage you to subscribe to this channel for more uplifting messages like this. If you've ever felt unseen or overlooked, this message is for you. Loneliness can feel like a heavy burden, but what if it's not a punishment? What if it's part of the process of becoming who you're meant to be? God works in quiet places. He shapes people in solitude because that's where we're the most moldable. When you strip away the noise, you're left with yourself and God. C.S Lewis once said, "All change is hard at first, messy in the middle, and gorgeous at the end." That's true for the seasons of isolation in our lives too. If you're feeling alone, you're not being ignored, you're being invested in. God is taking the time to shape you, to prepare you for something that's coming. You've been set apart, not cast aside. I want you to know that you've been chosen for a purpose that's bigger than you can imagine. But before the extraordinary happens, there's often a season where it's just you and God. When you're in a season of isolation, it's easy to ask, why me? My wife and I asked that question many times. There were countless moments when we felt like our circle of friends had shrunk down to almost nothing. We wondered why we weren't connecting with people like everyone else seemed to be. But over time, we came to understand something important. God often pulls you away from the crowd so you can focus on Him. When you don't have a lot of people around you, you're left with two choices: fill your time with distractions or use that time to grow. Many of us waste that time scrolling through social media, trying to fill the void. But God wants you to be still so you can hear His voice. That loneliness you feel, it's not meant to break you, it's meant to build you. Think about Jesus. Before He began His ministry, He spent 40 days in the wilderness, completely alone. He wasn't abandoned. He was being prepared. That's how God works. When He's getting ready to do something extraordinary in your life, He often leads you into a quiet place where it's just you and Him. And yes, it's hard. I remember my 21st birthday vividly. While my friends and even my brother were out celebrating, I was alone, walking along the beach, talking to God. I kept asking, why is my life like this? Why am I not out there having fun like everyone else? At the time, it felt like I was missing out. But now, looking back, I realized that God was doing something deep within me. He was pouring into me when I felt empty. He was setting a foundation for the future that I couldn't see yet. C.S Lewis also said, "Rock bottom became the solid foundation on which I rebuilt my life." If you feel like you've hit rock bottom, remember that God is using this time to lay a foundation for something beautiful. What feels like rejection is often God's way of making room for something greater. If you're in a season where it feels like your circle is small, don't be discouraged. When your calling is big, your circle often becomes small. That's not rejection, it's protection. My wife and I have had countless conversations about this. The deeper we've grown in our faith, the more we've realized that God has set us apart. It's not that we were meant to be alone forever, it's that He wanted to refine us before bringing the right people into our lives. You can't mix light with darkness and expect both to coexist peacefully. When God has a mission for your life, He will separate you from anything or anyone that doesn't align with that purpose. Even Jesus, though He had 12 disciples, kept His closest circle small, and one of them betrayed Him. That's because not everyone is meant to walk with you through every season. Sometimes God allows people to drift away so you can stay focused. This isn't about the quantity of friendships, it's about the quality. The right people will come into your life at the right time. People who understand your mission, who uplift you, who walk with you in purpose. But before that happens, God will often pull you away to ensure you're grounded in Him first. Even if you had a lot of friends right now, ask yourself, are they walking with God? Are they helping you grow? Or are they pulling you off track? Sometimes God removes people from your life to protect your purpose. C.S Lewis once said, "You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with." Think about that for a moment. Who are those 5 people in your life? Are they helping you walk closer to God or further away from Him? When your circle is small, it might feel lonely, but it's not something to fear, it's something to embrace. God isn't just taking people out of your life. He's making space for the right people to enter. And one day, you might be the person who creates a community of like-minded believers, a circle of friends who lift each other up and walk in faith together. But right now, God is teaching you how to stand firm on your own, how to lean on Him fully, and how to trust the process even when it's hard. When you feel unseen, remember that you are fully known and deeply loved by God. He's not just an observer, He's your closest companion, the one who stays when everyone else leaves. It's easy to forget that when social media is filled with pictures of parties and friend groups. But don't let those images deceive you. The most important relationship you'll ever have isn't with people, it's with God. Jesus showed us the perfect example of this. He often withdrew from the crowds to spend time alone with His Father. Even in His darkest moment, when He was praying in Gethsemane and His disciples fell asleep instead of staying awake with Him, Jesus leaned on God. That's the model for us. When no one else is around, God is always listening, always present, always faithful. Sometimes what feels like a loss is really a gain in disguise. C.S. Lewis said it best, "When we lose one blessing, another is often most unexpectedly given in its place." Loneliness, as painful as it can be, clears the way for God's presence to become even more real to us. When your heart feels empty, He fills it with His love. When you feel invisible, He reminds you that He sees you. There have been seasons in my life when friends drifted away, and I questioned why God allowed me to feel so alone. But in those quiet moments, God did His deepest work. He spoke to me in ways I couldn't have heard if I had been surrounded by distractions. He shaped me, strengthened me, and showed me His love in ways I never expected. If you're feeling lonely today, pour your heart out to God. Tell Him exactly how you feel. He can handle your honesty. Open the Bible and lean into His promises. Psalm 34 verse 18 says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Hold on to that truth. God isn't just someone you turn to when other relationships fail. He's the foundation of every relationship. The season of isolation you're in right now isn't happening to you, it's happening for you. He's not pulling you away to hurt you. He's pulling you away to protect and prepare you. Let this be the reminder you need. Your loneliness isn't the end of your story, it's the beginning of something extraordinary. If you're still here, I want to remind you that your feelings of isolation don't mean you're forgotten. Instead, they are a sign that God is working behind the scenes, preparing you for something you can't fully see yet. It's in these quiet moments that He molds us. When life feels still, don't mistake that for inaction. Just because you can't see the work doesn't mean the work isn't happening. I want you to hold on to this truth. God is intentional with everything He does, including your solitude. Sometimes we get so caught up in thinking that our lives are supposed to look a certain way, surrounded by people, full of plans, celebrations, and social events. But God's plan often looks very different from what we expect. When He's calling you to something bigger, He sets you apart. And here's the thing, being set apart can feel a lot like being left out. It's hard to understand that the loneliness you feel might actually be protection in disguise. When God pulls you away from the crowd, it's because He needs your focus. He's getting ready to pour into you in ways that a noisy world can't comprehend. You can't pour water into a cup that's already full of distractions and clutter. So God makes room. He clears out what doesn't belong so He can fill you with something greater. It's hard to see that in the moment, though, isn't it? When friends drift away, when invitations stop coming, when you feel like life is quieter than ever, it can feel personal, like something is wrong with you. But nothing could be further from the truth. You're not being punished, you're being positioned for something greater. I've seen this play out time and time again in my life. There have been moments when I prayed for connection, for community, for a sense of belonging, and yet God's answer wasn't what I expected. Instead of filling my life with more people, He filled it with more of His presence. And let me tell you, that changed everything. We often look at isolation as something to survive rather than something to grow through. But what if the season of loneliness is where you're meant to grow the most? What if God is using this time to refine you, to strengthen you, to teach you how to stand on your own 2 feet with Him as your foundation? Because the truth is, you can't build anything lasting without a strong foundation. And that foundation isn't built in front of an audience, it's built in the quiet, unseen moments where it's just you and God. Think back to some of the greatest figures in the Bible. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before God called him to lead his people out of Egypt. Can you imagine how lonely those years must have felt? 40 years is a long time to wait. It probably felt like his life had stalled, like nothing was happening. But in that wilderness, God was preparing Moses for one of the greatest missions of all time. What looked like isolation was really preparation. The same was true for David. Before he became king, he spent years tending sheep, overlooked and underestimated by his own family. But it was in those fields, alone with God, that David learned how to trust, how to lead, and how to fight. When the time came for him to face Goliath, he was ready not because of the applause of a crowd, but because of the quiet victories he'd won when no one else was watching. Your private battles prepare you for your public victories. You may be walking through your own wilderness right now, feeling overlooked and unseen. But I want you to know that God sees you. And not only does He see you, He's walking with you. The wilderness isn't a place where you're abandoned, it's a place where you're shaped. Sometimes, it takes isolation for us to see that God's presence has been there all along. When the noise fades away, His voice becomes clearer. I remember one particular season when I felt like I was wandering through my own wilderness. I had big dreams, but every door seemed to close. I saw other people moving forward in life, getting new jobs, making new friends, stepping into exciting seasons, and I felt stuck. It felt like God had forgotten me. But looking back now, I realized He was preparing me. The dreams I had weren't wrong, they were just premature. I wasn't ready yet, and if He had opened those doors too soon, I would have missed out on the growth He was doing in me. When you're in a waiting season, it's easy to feel like nothing is happening. But let me encourage you with this. Waiting is never wasted when you're waiting with God. Every quiet day, every lonely night, every unanswered prayer is part of something bigger. God doesn't work on our timeline, but He's always on time. You might not see it now, but one day, you'll look back and understand why this season was necessary. I know it can feel like you're missing out. Social media makes it even harder. Scrolling through highlight reels of other people's lives can make you feel like you're falling behind. But what you see online isn't the full story. Behind every perfect picture is a real person with their own struggles. Don't let comparison steal your joy or make you forget that your story is unfolding exactly as it should. In these moments of solitude, instead of scrolling and comparing, turn your focus to God. Spend time in prayer, even when the words don't come easily. Open your Bible and let His promises remind you that you're not alone. Psalm 46 verse 10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." There's power in being still, in surrendering your need for answers and trusting that He's in control. If you're wondering what you're supposed to do while you're waiting, here's the answer: grow. Use this time to develop your gifts, to learn, to deepen your relationship with God. When you feel lonely, look for ways to serve others. Sometimes the best way to fill an empty heart is to pour out love. When you focus on loving others, you'll be surprised how your perspective shifts. God often uses solitude to teach us who we really are, not who the world says we are, but who He created us to be. In the quiet, He reminds us of our identity, our worth, and our purpose. You are not defined by how many people you have around you. Your worth isn't tied to your social circle, it's tied to the one who created you. And He says you're chosen, loved, and called. I want to speak directly to anyone who feels unseen right now. You are not invisible to God. He knows your name, your heart, and your struggles. He knows the nights you've cried yourself to sleep, wondering if anyone notices your pain. And He cares. The same God who created the stars and calls them by name knows your name too. You are His masterpiece, His beloved child, and He is working in your life, even when you can't see it. Jesus himself knew the pain of being alone. In his darkest hour, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he asked his disciples to stay awake and pray with him, but they fell asleep. He faced that moment of anguish alone, but he wasn't truly alone. His Father was with him. And because Jesus walked that lonely road, you never have to walk yours alone. He understands your pain, and he offers you comfort that no earthly friendship can provide. When you feel like no one is there for you, remember that the Creator of the universe is with you. He's not a distant observer. He's a present help, a steady rock, and a faithful friend. He is closer than your next breath. Lean into him, and you'll find a peace that doesn't make sense to the world, but will guard your heart and mind. Your loneliness isn't the end, it's a chapter in the story God is writing. And his stories always end in redemption and purpose. If you feel small, remember that God often uses the small and hidden things to make the biggest impact. David was a shepherd before he was a king. Moses was a fugitive before he was a leader. And you? You are being prepared for something greater than you can imagine. In this journey of faith, it's easy to feel weighed down by seasons of isolation. Maybe you've asked yourself, is this really part of God's plan? Let me remind you, yes, it is. God's plans are often written in moments we least expect, in places where the world sees nothing happening. You may not be able to see it yet, but this season is a setup, not a setback. When God is about to do something significant in your life, he often pulls you aside first. That quiet space, where it feels like the world has forgotten you, is where he prepares you for something extraordinary. It's not punishment, it's preparation. But preparation is rarely comfortable. No one likes feeling overlooked, unheard, or out of place. Yet, in those moments of quiet, God is shaping you in ways that applause and attention never could. You see, when the noise fades away, you're left with what matters most: your relationship with God and your own growth. Think of a seed planted deep in the soil. It's buried, covered, and unseen. But it's not dead, it's growing. The darkness isn't its grave, it's its birthplace. That's what this season can be for you, the birthplace of something greater. If you feel like you're buried right now, I encourage you to remember that seeds only grow when they've been planted. And being planted often looks and feels a lot like being forgotten. But God hasn't forgotten you. In fact, he's watching over you, watering your growth, making sure that at the right time, you'll bloom. Many times, we pray for a breakthrough, but we aren't ready for the weight of what we're asking for. God knows this. That's why he refines us first. He's not just trying to give you blessings, he's preparing you to handle them. When you're asking for something big, God is going to prepare you in big ways. And sometimes that means being set apart, going through trials that make you stronger, wiser, and more dependent on him. One of the hardest lessons I've learned is that some doors close because God is protecting me. What I thought was rejection was really his redirection. I used to wonder why people walked out of my life, why friendships faded, or why opportunities slipped through my fingers. But over time, I've come to see that those losses weren't losses at all. They were God's way of clearing space for the right people, the right path, and the right purpose. Let me tell you something about purpose. It will always require pruning. Just like a gardener prunes a plant to help it grow stronger, God sometimes cuts away things in our lives that no longer serve his plan. That can feel painful, but it's necessary. You can't hold on to everything and still become who you're meant to be. Sometimes God removes things that we thought we needed so we can see that all we really need is him. Remember the story of Joseph? He had big dreams, visions of leadership, purpose, and influence. But before any of that came true, he was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and imprisoned. From the outside, it looked like his life was falling apart. But from God's perspective, Joseph's path was leading him exactly where he needed to be. If Joseph hadn't gone through the pit and the prison, he wouldn't have been prepared for the palace. What felt like isolation and betrayal was really part of God's plan to position him for greatness. Your story might feel like it's stuck in the middle, but don't forget God is the author. And he's not done writing. What feels like an ending could actually be a turning point. You may feel like Joseph in the prison, wondering how things will ever change. But just like Joseph, Your time will come. And when it does, you'll realize that every setback, every lonely night, every unanswered prayer was setting you up for something you couldn't imagine. One of the most beautiful things about God's plan is that He doesn't waste a single moment. He uses everything, the highs and the lows, the celebrations and the heartbreaks, to shape you into the person He created you to be. The world may look at your life and only see the wilderness, but God sees the promised land ahead. The wilderness is just the path you're taking to get there. I want you to reflect on something important. Who you're becoming during this season matters just as much as where you're going. If God gave you everything you've been praying for right now, would you be ready? Would you have the strength, the wisdom, and the character to carry the weight of that blessing? Sometimes God's greatest gift to us is time to grow, time to heal, time to prepare. I know it's not easy. There have been moments when I've cried out to God, asking why I felt so alone. But looking back, I realized that it was in those moments of solitude that I heard Him the clearest. When everything else was stripped away, I could finally hear His voice whispering, "I'm with you." And that's what I want you to know today. You are never truly alone. God is with you in the waiting, in the wondering, in the wilderness. It's tempting to rush the process, to try and fill the emptiness with temporary fixes, things that numb the pain but never really heal it. But don't settle for quick fixes when God is preparing you for lasting fulfillment. Trust His timing, even when it feels slow. Trust His plan, even when you don't understand it. Trust that He sees the whole picture, not just the piece you're living in right now. And while you wait, don't forget to take care of yourself. Rest isn't a sign of weakness, it's a commandment from God. In seasons of isolation, it's easy to overthink and spiral into exhaustion, but God calls us to rest in Him. When Jesus walked on earth, He often pulled away from the crowds to pray and recharge. If the Son of God needed quiet time with His Father, how much more do we? Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is slow down, breathe, and remember that you don't have to carry everything on your own. There's a peace that comes when you stop striving and start trusting. That doesn't mean the process becomes easy. It means you're no longer carrying it alone. When you let go of the need to control every detail and instead surrender to God's plan, you'll find a strength that goes beyond your own. Let me speak directly to your heart for a moment. Whatever you're facing, it's not bigger than God. Whatever fears you have, they don't define you. You may feel small, but the God inside you is greater than any obstacle outside of you. You may feel unseen, but God sees you fully and loves you completely. You may feel unsure of your next step, but God is already there, guiding your path. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is simply holding on when everything in you wants to give up. If you're feeling weary, I encourage you to keep pressing forward. Your story isn't over. This season of isolation is not the final chapter, it's part of the process. And on the other side of this process is something beautiful. The people God has meant for you will find you at the right time. The community you've been longing for will come when you're ready. But for now, God is teaching you to lean on Him alone. He's building something in you that can't be shaken. And when the right doors open, you'll walk through them with confidence, knowing that you've been prepared for such a time as this. God is working in your life, even when it feels like He's silent. He's the author of your story, and His stories never end in defeat, they end in victory. Keep walking, keep trusting, and know that something extraordinary is being written in your life. You may feel like you're in the waiting room right now, but God's timing is perfect. And when it all comes together, it will be more beautiful than you ever imagined. In seasons of isolation, it's easy to feel like you're stuck in a waiting room while life passes you by. You see other people stepping into their dreams, building friendships, achieving their goals, and you wonder, when will it be my turn? The truth is, it's already your turn, just not in the way you expected. This waiting season isn't wasted. God is doing something in you right now that is just as important as the things you're waiting for. He's building you from the inside out so that when the time comes, you'll be strong enough to carry the blessings He's preparing for you. I want you to pause and take this in. You are not forgotten. God hasn't overlooked you. You're not invisible to Him. Even if it feels like the world has moved on without you, God's eyes are on you. He knows every prayer you've whispered, every tear you've cried, and every fear you've held in your heart. And he's not distant, he's right there with you. Sometimes, God's greatest work happens in the quiet. Think about Elijah. After an incredible victory where God showed his power by sending fire from heaven, Elijah found himself alone, running for his life and hiding in a cave. He was exhausted, afraid, and felt completely alone. But in that quiet cave, God showed up not in the wind, not in an earthquake, and not in a fire, but in a gentle whisper. God's presence wasn't loud or overwhelming, it was soft and close, reminding Elijah that he wasn't alone. That's how God often speaks to us, not in grand, dramatic ways, but in the still, small moments when we're finally quiet enough to hear him. If you feel like you're in your own cave right now, waiting for answers, don't overlook the whisper. Don't miss the gentle reminder that God is with you. One of the hardest things about loneliness is the way it makes you question your worth. You start wondering if something is wrong with you, if you're not enough, or if you've somehow failed. But let me tell you something. Your worth was never tied to how many people are around you or how full your calendar is. Your worth is rooted in the unchanging truth that you are loved by God. You were created with purpose, and nothing, no season of loneliness or setback can take that away from you. When God sets you apart, it can feel like separation from the life you thought you wanted. But in reality, it's preparation for the life you were made for. We often hold on to our plans so tightly that we forget God's plans are better. And sometimes he has to loosen our grip by taking away the things that don't belong so he can place something better in our hands. You might feel like you've been stripped of relationships, opportunities, or dreams that you once held dear. But could it be that God is making room for something greater? Sometimes, losing what we thought we wanted is the only way to gain what we truly need. C.S. Lewis once said, "There are far, far better things ahead than any we leave behind." That's not just a hopeful thought, it's a promise you can hold on to when everything feels like it's falling apart. Think of Ruth in the Bible. She lost everything: her husband, her home, and her security. She could have stayed in Moab, clinging to the life she'd known. Instead, she chose to step out in faith, following her mother-in-law Naomi to a foreign land with nothing but trust in God. It wasn't an easy path, but God was weaving something beautiful behind the scenes. Ruth's story didn't end in loss, it ended in restoration and purpose. She became part of the lineage that led to Jesus himself. What looked like a season of loss was really a setup for something extraordinary. Your story isn't over. Just like Ruth, just like Joseph, and just like Elijah, God is working behind the scenes of your life. The chapter you're in right now may feel like it's full of unanswered questions and quiet days, but the author of your story is writing something breathtaking. When the next chapter comes, you'll see how every page was necessary. But here's the thing. Waiting well doesn't mean sitting in frustration or bitterness. It means showing up every day, even when you don't see immediate results. It means trusting God's heart even when you can't see his hand. Faith isn't about having all the answers, it's about holding on to hope when you have none. It's about believing that God's silence doesn't mean he's absent. While you wait, let God strengthen you. Let him build resilience in you. There's a depth of faith that only comes from seasons of isolation. When you walk through the valley with God, you come out stronger than you ever imagined. You come out with a testimony that can only be born from the trials you've endured. You learn to rely on him in ways you never would have if life had always been easy. I remember a time when I felt like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. I was trying so hard to figure out my future, to make things happen on my own, and it felt like every step I took was met with a closed door. But it was in that exhaustion that I finally surrendered. I remember praying, "God, I can't do this on my own anymore. I need you." And in that moment of surrender, I felt a peace that didn't make sense, a peace that came from knowing that I didn't have to have it all figured out because he already did. Sometimes God waits for us to stop striving so he can step in and carry what we were never meant to carry alone. If you're feeling burdened, if you're exhausted from trying to do it all, I want to remind you of Jesus' words in Matthew 11 verses 28 to 30. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. God isn't asking you to figure everything out. He's asking you to trust Him, to rest in Him, and to let Him lead. Isolation isn't the end, it's the beginning of transformation. The quiet seasons are where God does His deepest work. When everything is stripped away, that's when you learn that God is truly enough. And when you realize that, you become unshakable. No storm can move you when your foundation is built on Him. If you've been holding on to fear, uncertainty, or pain, I want to encourage you to let go and lay it at His feet. He's strong enough to carry what you can't. He's faithful enough to finish what He started in your life. And His love is deep enough to fill every empty space in your heart. This journey isn't easy, but it's worth it. You are being shaped into someone who reflects God's glory, who walks in purpose, and who shines even in the darkest places. The friendships, the opportunities, and the dreams that God has for you will come in His time, and they will be better than anything you could have planned for yourself. Until then, keep walking in faith. Keep believing that what you're going through now is temporary, but what God is building in you is eternal. As you continue walking through this season, I want you to know that you're not walking aimlessly. God has a purpose for every step. Even when it feels like you're taking slow, uncertain steps in the dark, He's guiding you. Isolation can feel heavy, like a weight you're carrying, but it's not meant to break you, it's meant to build you. There's something sacred about solitude when we see it through God's eyes. The world tells us that busyness and constant connection are signs of a fulfilling life. But some of the most transformative moments happen in the stillness, away from the noise. When everything else fades, that's when you begin to hear the voice of the one who's been there all along, whispering, "I'm with you." We often pray for God to change our situation, but sometimes He uses the situation to change us. He refines us in the quiet places because that's where our hearts are most open. When there are no distractions, no applause, and no one else to run to, we finally turn our eyes fully to Him. I want you to imagine what could happen if you embrace this season instead of fearing it. What if, instead of resisting the stillness, you welcomed it as an invitation to grow? What if you chose to see your isolation not as a punishment, but as a season of preparation? Because that's exactly what it is. God isn't wasting your time, He's investing in you. You've probably heard the phrase, "You can't pour from an empty cup." But the truth is, before God can fill you, sometimes He has to empty you of fears that no longer serve you, of habits that hold you back, and of relationships that were never meant to stay. That process can be painful, but it's necessary. You may feel like you're losing parts of yourself, but what's really happening is that God is making room for something new, something better. If you're wondering why it feels like people have drifted away, it's because not everyone is meant to go where God is taking you. Some friendships, though meaningful in their season, can't withstand the weight of your calling. And that's okay. Don't mourn the people who left, bless them and release them. Trust that the ones who are meant to walk this journey with you will find you at the right time. I want to remind you of Gideon's story. When God called Gideon to lead Israel to victory, He didn't give him a massive army. In fact, God intentionally reduced Gideon's troops from thousands to just 300. Why? Because God wanted Gideon to see that the victory wouldn't come from numbers or strength, it would come from Him. Sometimes, God will reduce your circle not to hurt you, but to show you that His power works best in places where you feel small. It's not about who's standing with you, it's about the God who stands behind you. When your circle gets smaller, your faith has a chance to grow bigger. When the distractions fall away, you start to see more clearly what really matters. God isn't just pruning you, He's positioning you. And when He positions you, no one can take your place. What He has for you is for you. You don't have to strive for it or compete for it. All you have to do is stay faithful. I know the waiting feels long. I know it's tempting to settle for less just to fill the void. But don't trade God's best for a temporary fix. Don't rush into friendships, relationships, or opportunities that aren't from Him just because you're tired of feeling alone. Remember, God's timing is perfect. The people and opportunities He brings into your life will align with His plan for you. They won't pull you away from your purpose. One of the most beautiful things about God is that He meets us in the middle of our waiting. You don't have to reach a certain level of perfection or have it all together before He steps in. He meets you right where you are, even in the middle of your doubts and fears. Psalm 34 verse 18 reminds us that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. If you feel crushed by the weight of loneliness, know that God's presence is closer than you think. There's a story I love in the Gospels about a woman who had been suffering for years. She had tried everything and still found no relief. But one day, she saw Jesus walking by. She didn't let the crowd or her fear stop her. She reached out and touched the hem of his robe. In that moment, everything changed. She was healed. Her story reminds me that sometimes all it takes is reaching out to God in faith, even when you feel too weak to take another step. He sees even the smallest act of faith and responds with love. If you feel like you're running out of strength, reach out. Don't let the enemy convince you that you're too far gone or that God has forgotten you. He hasn't. Even if all you can say is, "God, I need you," that's enough. He hears every whisper, catches every tear, and holds you in the palm of His hand. Your story isn't over, it's just beginning. What you're going through right now is part of the process, not the end result. And the best part? God is faithful to finish what He started. He doesn't abandon His work halfway through. Philippians 1 verse 6 says, "Being confident of this, that He who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus." God didn't bring you this far just to leave you. He's preparing you for something greater. So, what do you do while you wait? You stay rooted in Him. You pray even when you don't feel like it. You fill your heart with His Word. You surround yourself with reminders of His promises. You keep showing up, trusting that every small act of faith matters. And you rest in the knowledge that He is working even when you can't see it. I know it's hard to wait. I know the silence can feel deafening at times. But remember this, even in the quiet, God is speaking. Even in the stillness, He's moving. And when the time comes, everything He's been preparing for you will unfold in ways that exceed your expectations. Take a deep breath and remind yourself that you're exactly where you need to be in this moment. You're not behind, you're being refined. You're not forgotten, you're being formed. And when the time is right, you'll step into everything God has for you with boldness and joy, knowing that you were prepared for this. If this message has encouraged you, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more messages that speak to your heart. And if you're walking through a season of isolation, share your story in the comments. I'd love to pray for you and remind you that you're not alone. Someone out there needs to know that they're not the only one feeling this way. Let's build a community where we lift each other up in faith. As you move forward, hold on to this truth. God's timing is perfect, His plans are good, and His love for you is unshakable. You may feel like you're in the waiting room now, but your story isn't over. God's masterpiece always takes time. So keep trusting, keep believing, and keep walking forward. The best is yet to come, and you are never, ever alone. Be blessed and stay strong. God's got you, and He always will.